For the first generation, sacrifice and death. For the second generation, hardship and struggle. For the third generation, bread. Excerpt from the Settler's Song. The effect of the Minuteman victories over the Institute, the Gunners, and the Raider clans was most profoundly felt by the common inhabitants of the wasteland. The lawless East Coast suddenly had a legitimate government defended by a competent military. A free land where one could live with the expectation of raising a family in safety, and full of opportunities to prosper. In this episode we will review how the average person in the Commonwealth lived. How basic needs like food, water, and power were met. How the economy worked, what businesses were started and what entertainments that they had at this time. The first wave of immigration came from the surrounding New England states. Traders shared news of the Minuteman victories with those they met along the caravan routes. As soon as word came that the Institute and the Gunners had both been defeated in less than a year, hundreds and later thousands uprooted their lives and headed to the Commonwealth to start anew. Entire settlements left to find prosperity and safety under the flag of an organized state. In the New Hampshire region, only rugged individualists and anarchists remained. Those that the Minutemen would later come to know as the Green Mountain Militia. The Great Eastern Migration of 2289 saw streams of people coming from north and west of the Commonwealth. Minutemen at first thought this was an invading army of raiders. They advised the government, who in turn set up refugee camps to best house and distribute the new settlers. As immigrants came in, they became integrated into existing settlements. The Commonwealth Land Office opened some abandoned settlements like Fairline Estates, Breakheart Banks, and University Point to new arrivals to assimilate the newcomers as quickly as possible. The second wave arrived in 2292. These hailed from New York, Appalachia, and the Pit. The different accents that they had made integration more difficult. Many of these headed to live and work in the city where factories, workshops, and sweatshops needed labor to manufacture all manner of goods that the young Commonwealth needed to grow. As these immigrants arrived, integrating these people into the Commonwealth, and providing the basic necessities of life became the government's primary concern. The Pridwin Accord of early 2288 was the first trade deal between the Commonwealth and the Brotherhood of Steel. Brokered by the sole survivor, this would form the basis of the food processing plant deal and later the New England Treaty of Alliance. The accord bartered large quantities of engine coolant for the Pridwin in exchange for Brotherhood technical expertise on a range of technical matters. The Brotherhood stockpiled the coolant necessary for the Pridwin to make the long journey back to the capital wasteland. Brotherhood technicians would show up at settlements to fix power generators, water pumps, and to fix emergency radio beacons. As the technicians fixed things for settlers, they also taught them how to fix and maintain the items. Over time this created long-lasting bonds between the Commonwealth and the Brotherhood. But the Brotherhood could not solve all the Commonwealth's technical problems. The Science Center at Diamond City was a focus of technical activity in the early years and provided a homegrown solution. Commonwealth scientists and engineers gathered here to exchange knowledge and produce new inventions and applications to benefit the young nation. One of the first problems that they tackled was that of electrical power. The Commonwealth electric grid was mainly underground and mostly intact. However, only local generators provided power for the meager electrical needs at the time. As the city began to grow, the electrical needs multiplied. A centralized and managed grid needed to be developed. Sometime after the Great War, some refugees took over Fenway Park and turned it into a fortified settlement. Someone with a bit of technical knowledge repurposed an emergency fusion generator to serve as the settlement's power source. This was placed underground in the center of Diamond City and powered a stadium for more than 100 years. Commonwealth scientists and Brotherhood technicians looked at the fusion generator in Diamond City and were horrified by what they found. The pieced-together contraption at the center of Diamond City was extremely inefficient, leaked low-level radiation, and seemed to be constantly on the verge of exploding. The technicians carefully powered down the reactor and took it apart. They replaced it with a pair of refurbished micro-fusion generators to power Diamond City and the surrounding neighborhood. To provide the bulk of the energy needed by the Commonwealth, engineers from the Science Center refurbished the Poseidon Solar and Wind Power Station in the southern Commonwealth. Commonwealth Reconstruction Corps crews replaced damaged transmission lines to hook this up to the power grid. As time passed, more power stations would be added to the grid. Water was a chief concern of all inhabitants of the wasteland. Most surface water supplies around the world had been poisoned by nuclear fallout from the nuclear exchange. Only a few isolated areas had been spared. New England had a peculiar advantage, however. The underground water supplies lay in the solid bedrock layer. This layer that contained clean groundwater was particularly close to the surface. Almost any farmer could dig a well and reach underground water untainted by the fallout. However, President Hancock knew that this was not a long-term solution. Eventually the aquifers would be drained. With the combined technical assistance of Brotherhood technicians, Commonwealth scientists, and irrigation specialists from Grey Gardens, the Western Water Plant was reconditioned to purify water from the Charles River. The CRC began a 5-year-long program to restore pre-war water pipelines to carry purified water to all parts of the Commonwealth. As the government owned the utilities, water and power were at first provided for free to Commonwealth residents. The allure of this helped draw immigrants from other parts of the country. When population grew, however, the costs of maintenance and expansion of utilities proved to be too much, and regular billing began to take place. Mass transit became an achievement that the Commonwealth desperately wanted to realize. Boston was honeycombed with subway tunnels and rail lines covered the surface. However, many of these were damaged during the war. The Commonwealth Robotics Collective teamed up with the CRC to dig out some of these collapsed sections. By 2292 the first run from Diamond City to Good Neighbor opened. Other lines were slowly reopened that would link northern Boston to the downtown area. Eventually lines would be opened to the south and west. As cars and trucks would be years away from being commonplace, subways and railroads would be the fastest way to ship people and products around the Commonwealth. One of the more silent dangers of the Commonwealth were the number of cars and pickup trucks on the highways and streets of the Boston area. Every child that grew up in the Commonwealth knew that damaged cars could explode. Only the most unaware of travelers would venture near them. Brotherhood scribes wondered why such seemingly dangerous vehicles were allowed on the pre-war highways. Technicians working on this problem stumbled across the answer. Pre-war technical documents retrieved from the Corps Vega assembly plant in Lexington showed the dangerous flaw in the vehicles. Pre-war fusion-powered cars relied on a complicated set of safety devices installed in the engine compartments to moderate the fusion reaction. As cars and pickup trucks were smaller than buses or trucks, newly developed microchip technology was used to moderate the reactions. When the nuclear bombs of the Great War started going off, the microchips in the cars were subject to intense electromagnetic pulses. The delicate microchips that regulated the safety equipment for the fusion engines were destroyed. Now, any imbalance or damage to the engine could result in a runaway fusion reaction that would culminate in an explosion. Using technical guides, Brotherhood scribes were able to custom replicate the safety microchips for vehicles. With the safety systems restored, trucks and cars could be safely driven for the first time in 200 years. The Brotherhood did not share this knowledge with the Commonwealth. The elders of the Brotherhood debated on the merits of releasing this information and how it might affect their own interests. Helping the Commonwealth with a few vertibirds was one thing. Allowing the Commonwealth access to entire fleets of vehicles and possibly even armored vehicles was another matter. The Brotherhood would keep this technology private for now. However, some information did eventually leak out and Commonwealth researchers began experimenting with restoring vehicles as early as 2296. Implementing all these infrastructure repairs cost a considerable amount of capital. The bottle cap, a mainstay of the wasteland economy, was not up to the task. A new currency would be needed. Even before the Far Harbor intervention, government leaders had discussed moving away from using bottle caps as currency. Samples of NCR dollars had made their way cross-country, and business leaders were quite impressed and saw the potential of a new form of currency. However, the general populace would not easily accept a new currency, especially one without any real backing. Bottle caps themselves had been introduced as currency by the water barons of old California in the early years after the Great War. The idea was that each bottle cap represented the value of a single bottle of clean drinking water. Years later, the bottle of water was forgotten and the cap itself became a token of value. During the Far Harbor crisis, John Stockton realized that in order to finance the war in the North and to fix the problems of the Commonwealth, that they would need more bottle caps than existed in the entire Commonwealth. Some in the government proposed minting new bottle caps. The technology to do this was not too complicated, and the government could control the supply of caps. Others, however, thought that this would devalue the currency and lead to a financial panic. Instead, the government decided to introduce a totally new currency with the value based on clean water. The government owned the water purification plants in the Commonwealth. The new water shilling was first issued with a value of 2 shillings to 1 cap. The value of the shilling fluctuated as the availability of clean water changed over time. This would lead to some periods of inflation and deflation. The government hoped that once the currency was well established, that they could unlink the value of the currency to the water supply. In order to force people to accept the new currency, laws were enacted to make it mandatory to pay taxes in shillings and to accept shillings as payment from the government. Newspapers criticized the move. Strikes took place in early 2292 in all the major settlements. People protested this move by the government and some violence took place. However, victories over the children of Atom and the gunners soon quieted down critics. The Commonwealth was here to stay, and so was the shilling. The first banks opened almost as soon as the Institute had been destroyed. The Diamond City Merchants Bank and the Good Neighbor Credit Union were the only places that people could borrow money besides organized crime groups. Loans from these institutions went to financing the opening of several small businesses, some of which would grow larger over time. Farming was the trade that most wastelanders knew. Razor grain, wheat, and corn were the two principal staple crops. Grain for making breads and cereal products. Corn for animal feed, hard liquor, and fuel. Existing farms expanded their fields to levels that were unimaginable just 2 years earlier. Brahmin trains carried the crops to grinding mills set up across the Commonwealth to process the valuable crop. A basic commodities exchange opened in Bunker Hill. Commodities such as wheat, corn, Brahmin, lumber, and other products were bought and sold daily. Shrewd traders made fortunes predicting the future demand and supply of raw goods in the Commonwealth. In the coming decades, stocks would be added to the exchange as business and free enterprise began to reappear in the Commonwealth. One of the first successful businesses was the Minutemen and Brotherhood food cannery. Begun in 2288 as a way to feed the Brotherhood and to secure technical assistance for the Commonwealth, the cannery soon began to generate a surplus of processed and packaged foods. Surplus packaged and prepared meals began to be sold to civilians. First inside the Commonwealth and then by caravans outside of the Commonwealth. To people in the wasteland, used to eating 200-year-old tinned food, rotting meat, or whatever weeds grew around them, new packaged foods seemed fantastical wonders from the future. Farmers, hunters, and ranchers were well paid and were encouraged to grow more vegetables and to provide more meat to keep the cannery at full capacity. After a few years, the cannery was bought out by investors and renamed Liberty Meals Incorporated. Other food manufacturers began creating packaged foods. Factory spaces such as the Four-Leaf Fish Packing Plant and Wilson Atomar Toys were refitted to begin producing packaged foods. Food companies such as Liberty Meals, Commonwealth Soups, and Boston Millers Association made fortunes manufacturing packaged foods that were soon being traded as far as St. Louis and Miami. New flavors were added to make use of what the post-war environment had to offer. Radstag, Meyerlurk, and Brahmin were favorites. As people outside of the Commonwealth became aware of these products, demand skyrocketed. More farms were established, and ranchers began gathering larger herds of animals to meet the growing demand for these foods. Fishing settlements along the coast appeared. Settlers fixed up old wrecks and went out into the ocean to harvest massive quantities of fish and other aquatic life. These could be sold to the canneries or to markets in Diamond City and as far inland as Sanctuary. Some of these settlements became commercial ports and made money loading and unloading goods coming in and going out to other ports up and down the east coast. Others specialized in repairing and refurbishing old fishing vessels. Small homegrown businesses began to appear. Micro-scale manufacturing occurred in settlements and in the city to meet the demand of domestic goods that could not be scavenged. Pots, pans, cutlery, tools, and other goods were constructed in these tiny workshops and sold in local markets. Trudy, a diner owner in the Western Commonwealth, teamed up with Wolfgang, an investor, and reopened drumline diners across the Commonwealth. These diners helped feed the growing number of manufacturing and construction workers. Sweatshops were set up to begin weaving fiber into the first new mass-produced clothes in centuries. Construction companies contracted to the CRC had contracts to repair or replace buildings in and around Boston. They brought in granite from local quarries, lumber from Far Harbor and iron girders from Sargas Iron Works to bring Boston back to life. The Commonwealth Robot Collective sent robots into the subway system to clear away rubble from collapsed areas. They also sent robots to collect and process radioactive waste. This would later be used to make fusion cores and fission batteries. Two major manufacturers in the Commonwealth were the Sargas Iron Works and the Lexington Universal Factory. Sargas had been a minor foundry before the war. Recently it had been the hideout for a brutal band of raiders. After the Gunner War, the Iron Works was cleared of debris and prepared to begin smelting metals again. All manner of debris from wrecked cars, to building debris, to refrigerators were hauled in by Brahmin train on a daily basis. These were melted down and recast to make new steel girders, metal pipes, and all the metallic framework that the Commonwealth needed. Immigrants from the pit were particularly sought after for their experience working in the dangerous conditions. Manufacturing in the Commonwealth was mainly being done in small-scale factories at various settlements. President Hancock did not like the piecemeal nature of the small factories. He wanted to concentrate everything in one site. The Lexington Automotive Assembly Plant produced cars before the Great War. It had been in Raider hands till after the Raider War of 2289. In 2290, Hancock announced an initiative to refurbish the plant and move all manufacturing to the various halls. Lexington became a factory town. From the Lexington Universal Factory came ammunition, tools, furniture. Years later appliances, electronics, and even vehicles would come out of the factory. Such achievements were regularly highlighted in newspapers and magazines of the era. But the problems of the Commonwealth also made front-page news. Media companies sprang up. In the basement of the Boston Bugle, scavengers found a dozen printing presses in working order. Piper Wright took one to bolster her newspaper, but others took some of the machines to begin their own magazines and print shops. Printed materials began to be sold all over the Commonwealth. Even those that could not read were able to enjoy the pictures and photos. Other assorted printed materials such as flyers, labels, and government forms began to be produced. The explosion of printed materials made wood pulp, for making paper, to become one of the largest imports into the Commonwealth, right after construction lumber. Distributing these printed materials beyond the local newsstand was difficult. Newspapers and magazines were one of the first ways that news spread across the Commonwealth. Caravan traders were hired to distribute the papers for a cut of the profit. Radio had longer range, but not many in the Commonwealth had access to working radios. President Hancock made it a priority to refurbish pre-war radios and to distribute at least one for every settlement so people could keep up to date on what was happening in the Commonwealth. Radio stations like Diamond City Radio, Freedom Radio, and WRVR provided news and entertainment around the clock. Later on, the Brotherhood would arrange for the signal from Galaxy News Radio in the capital wasteland to be relayed north by their Needham base to the rest of the Commonwealth. Getting private messages across the wasteland was almost impossible for the average wastelander. While groups like the government, the Brotherhood, or mercenary outfits could use radios or computer networks, the average person relied on caravans to carry letters or packages to people in other settlements. Two independent groups were set up to meet this need. The Commonwealth Postal Network was initially set up using public funds. A central office in downtown Boston received all packages and letters. The Postal Service used the address system created by their pre-war counterparts to route deliveries. Depending on where the package was sent, they would charge different rates. Heavily armed couriers would then be assigned to deliver large numbers of packages and letters. The second group was the Commonwealth Telegraph and Message Service. Using existing telephone lines, the service set up several small telegraph offices throughout the Commonwealth that could send and receive simple text messages and have local runners deliver the messages. Set up by private investors, the service was expensive and only worked in the Commonwealth and Far Harbor. However, it was the fastest way that the average person could send a message until more sophisticated messaging services were developed. One of the more significant projects undertaken at this time was Project Phoenix. When the Minutemen entered the Boston Public Library, they found the bodies of Curator Givens and the rest of his team. Givens had been trying to preserve the contents of the library by copying books into digital format. Unfortunately, they were all killed when super mutants broke in. Both the Commonwealth and the Brotherhood realized the immense value of this work and negotiated a treaty to continue the project and share the knowledge. Under Project Phoenix, the Brotherhood would assist in copying books and would receive a digital copy in exchange for sharing books from the Library of Congress facility in the Capital Wasteland. In addition, scavengers were paid for bringing in books and technical documents from the wasteland. Besides the immense trove of technical data, many works of literature were saved for future generations to enjoy. Copies of the books saved at the Boston Public Library would one day make up the core of the Commonwealth University Library. Begun as a trade school to foster the skills needed for workers to accomplish technical tasks, the University of the Commonwealth soon expanded to cover a variety of topics. The campus shifted locations various times until it was permanently located near College Square Station. Scientists, technicians, and engineers from the Science Center came by on a regular basis to teach as guest lecturers. Later, the university would expand to include colleges of agriculture, science, liberal arts, medicine, and law. A research branch was opened in the recently rediscovered Vault 88. Overseer, now Chief Scientist Barstow, reorganized the vault as the University of the Commonwealth Research Institute. This would take the place of the Science Center in Diamond City after 2297. Religious freedom was guaranteed in the Commonwealth Constitution. The Far Harbor intervention and the war with the Children of Atom tested this principle to the limit. Although not all Children of Atom worshippers were zealots, Minutemen patrols found and captured zealots crossing through the Commonwealth to fight on the island. The government decided to intern all Children of Atom worshippers found in the Commonwealth during the war. They were imprisoned right alongside raiders, gunners, and other criminals. Worshippers from other religious sects such as those from the Abbey of the Road, Hubologists, and the All Faiths Chapel took the Children of Atom case to court. In a unanimous decision, the High Court ruled that to blame all the Children of Atom worshippers for the action of some was unconstitutional. Those Children of Atom worshippers not currently fighting the Commonwealth were released. As busy as people in the Commonwealth were, they still needed time off to relax. A variety of pastimes existed for them to enjoy. Organized sports began to take root. Mo Cronin was finally convinced that his bats had other purposes than murder, and he helped organize the first baseball teams in 200 years. Children in the Commonwealth played with giddy-up buttercup toys. A ghoul from the slog began crafting these along with Jangles the Moon Monkey and other toys. Eventually these began to be made at the Lexington factory. Traveling entertainers would tour the outer settlements. Some would perform songs, others would put on plays or tell amusing stories. Most often they were repaid with food, although some might be lucky enough to receive a few caps. Gambling was a popular pastime for city dwellers. Gambling tables were set up in some of the more popular bars like the Third Rail, the Combat Zone, and the Dugout. Farmers and workers could come in and lose an entire week's wages in a couple of hours. Professional players became well known throughout the Commonwealth. Some games would end in violence. Professional fighting was discouraged but never stopped. The best fighters might end up in Tommy Lonergan's place in Boston. Others though would tour settlements picking fights with the best fighters in the settlements and making a living through wagers. Movies and newsreels made a comeback as well. The Science Center fixed some old projectors for the Starlight Drive settlement. The settlement made money showing movies and newsreels. People would walk for miles to watch the movies. The Commonwealth News Corporation and Commonwealth Pictures were two early examples of the new media companies. Commonwealth citizens were considered well informed, and the news media often brought to light the problems that the Commonwealth still faced. Bigotry and racism remained as big problems in the Commonwealth. Although equal opportunity and protection under the law existed in the new constitution, ghouls and those suspected of being synths faced harassment on a daily basis. Ghouls were often segregated in restaurants, bars, and even in some settlements. Those suspected of being synths found it difficult to get jobs and might be subject to verbal and physical abuse. Wealth inequity began to rise as the Commonwealth changed to the new currency. Land and commodity speculators could make fortunes and pay little in taxes. Those with connections within the government could expect lucrative government contracts for their companies. As more settlers arrived, the more desirable and valuable settlement areas began to fill up. Less land was available to farm. New arrivals were forced to move to Boston to find work at a variety of trades. The pressure to find more and better areas to settle partly led the drive for the Commonwealth to expand out of its borders and to seek new lands. This pressure was temporarily relieved by the addition of Far Harbor as a colony. But soon, the Commonwealth began to look north and west for new lands to add to the Commonwealth. This would inevitably lead to conflict. It was the people of the Commonwealth that built up a nation from the radioactive rubble of the past, and turned it into a great power. Much has been made about the contributions of individuals first creating and then growing the Commonwealth. Of generals in battle, of the leadership of politicians, and of savvy businessmen starting great companies. But in the end it was the Minuteman, the common farmer, the foundry worker, the sweatshop laborer, that sacrificed their lives, that worked the rocky soil, that did the most to rebuild civilization. It is to the common man that this documentary is dedicated to.